Being off air live. We're
Live.
live.
Um,
Hello. Hello,
okay,
George.
hi everyone. We are starting a little bit late because the technology is really cooperating with us today, but we have it under control, I think. So thanks so much for joining us. I'm just gonna post the URL on Twitter so that we can get going. But today we have the awesome Bonnie Stewart with us, who is going to talk with us about networks of care and vulnerability. And I'm really excited to have her join us. Bonnie is a doctoral student at the University of Prince Edward Island, and she has some amazing stories about the place that she lives. And I'm going to pass it over to Bonnie to give her a chance to tell us a little bit about herself and her work while I pass this along, the link along to Twitter as well.
Perfect. Because I just told Twitter that I was here, but I wasn't able to pass the link to the other computer. Hi, everybody. I am delighted to be here today. My name is Bonnie Stewart, and I am a fifth year PhD candidate, gradually trucking along towards my doctoral degree. What I have been looking at, I work in the Faculty of Education at the University of Prince Edward Island. I'm a coordinator of adult teaching, and so I work with our local community college as well as our campus faculty to try to build adult-focused programs. Interestingly, my online work has ended up informing and shaping some of that work as well, because I look at the practices of networks. And my research focuses specifically on network scholars, but I've been really interested in some of the ways in which the principles of adult learning and andragogy and sort of respect for what people know informs both the adult teaching area and sometimes the network practice and network learning areas. And so that intersection is where I do a lot of my thinking and my writing. I do a lot of my thinking and my writing out loud on Twitter. I'm at Bon Stewart on Twitter, Stewart. And my blog is theory.cribchronicles.com.
Awesome. Thank you, Bonnie, so much. And I think I've expressed my excitement for having you, but if that wasn't clear, it's awesome that you're here. But I have a few questions created that would help us kind of get on a discussion about ideas pertaining to the course and ideas that also seem to be central to your work. So I'm just going to start by asking kind of to tell us a little bit more about your study of online networks and social media, in the sense of I guess, why are you passionate about this topic? So why is this topic a topic that you feel is worthy of your time and efforts and attention, when you could be, I don't know, hanging out with your husband or children or whatever, or studying other things? Why is this significant to you?
To me, it's hugely significant that we look at networks as part of scholarship, partly because I think that networks and social media are a big part of our culture at this point, and they're an extension of our society and our social spaces. But they don't operate on identical terms to the material and social worlds that we live in simultaneously, or that we experience in the so-called offline. Replicable, scalable, and searchable. And those affordances of communications alter the ways in which we do scholarship, the ways in which we relate to each other, the behaviors that get rewarded in online spaces. And I think it's really key that we begin to take online practices and network practices seriously as sites of examination, partly because I think they are shaping some of our cultural norms, partly because I think there's also room to shape some of those practices if we are reflexive about them. And as higher ed in particular is in sort of huge flux, thinking about what it means to know in this context of networked abundance, and how to make knowledge in ways that make sense within the context of networked abundance is really important. For me, really, I came to the network space before I went back to do my PhD. So I finished my master's back in 2000. I had worked all over the world as a teacher and an instructor in universities. And when I went online, really, as an identity, was in about 2006, and I blogged for a couple of years, fairly actively, totally outside of the academic world before I ended up going back to school to do my PhD. So I went in to study specifically what networks meant because I had been engaging in them and watching them change for 3 or 4 years, and I wanted to think actively about what this meant for society and what this meant for knowledge and education and all those pieces. So yeah, I thought of it as a really kind of valuable and interesting way to spend my time.
Cool, awesome. As you know, this week we're looking at the issues of caring and vulnerability on network spaces, and to me, those two concepts mean a couple of things, right? They, on the one hand, caring means the idea, or refers to the idea that when academics go online, they express care to one another. They express that in different ways, and they make themselves vulnerable by sharing information that might not have been shared in other spaces, or information that's traditionally safe to be shared with a particular group, like your spouse or your pastor or whatever. And in our conversations and in the blog post that you shared a couple of days ago, it seems like you have a different perspective of what caring and vulnerability look like, right? And I think it's interesting to me how different conceptions of those two terms can exist and be there at the same time, and both of them be present. So I guess I want to ask you to tell us a little bit more about what your concept of caring and vulnerability is.
This is where we get the fisticuffs.
And and what is it that kind of keeps you up at night when you're thinking about that topic?
For sure. Like I said, I mean, I did come to this area of study actually from a position of great privilege. I have been deeply cared for by my networks for 7 or 8 years. And so the type of vulnerability, I think you framed it in the week's discussion, by saying that absolutely networks are not neutral. And I think that that's key, right? I don't think of networked technologies simply as tools. I think that they are very much extensions of things that we do as human beings and extensions of social space. And I've experienced a great deal of caring in this space, and actually I came to it from the type of sharing and making myself vulnerable. What I would talk about as maybe a vulnerability with agency was the way that I came in, because I began blogging about 2 weeks before my eldest child was born. And it was also about a year after my firstborn child, who died at birth, had been born and died. And so my initial years online were very intimate, personal. My blog was essentially a series of reflections on identity that was initially simply a place to speak sort of the mutually incompatible identity of being very excited about a new baby, and at the same time living with all of, as I was big-bellied and pregnant and walking around in the world, is this your first? And not being able to answer those questions in ways that felt like I wasn't betraying the child who was not there. And so I actually did a great deal of very vulnerable writing online in my early days. And that sharing, to my surprise, because when I began, I didn't know that there was such a thing as a mommy blog. I did not know that there was such a thing as grief blogs. I ended up, over time, gradually finding myself in this deep narrative world where people wrote beautifully about, really profound aspects of the human condition and really serious struggles. And I ended up with a blog that was much bigger than I had ever imagined it would be. I ended up with a large and fairly robust network of people who supported me through a great deal of, healing and growing as a person and becoming a writer in my own mind. So all of those things and that concept of vulnerability as valuable very much is where I was situated when I, began my study of network scholarship. And I definitely benefited a great deal from the care of many people and still continue to. But as I have watched networks scale, and I think scale is really key, and by scale I mean the sizing up, the massifying. As I've watched networks scale and become something that people are increasingly aware of, and that the media is increasingly aware of, and that the media, and particularly like the sort of not just the 24-hour CNN media, but the BuzzFeed media and the Gawker media, looks to Twitter and to Facebook as sites from which to pull quotes for the latest outrage story. I watch people become vulnerable in different ways that I don't think of as necessarily stemming from the same kind of agency as choosing to share. Because even online, there is the phenomenon of context collapse, where instead of having different facets of identity that you choose to present particular communications to separate audiences, right? So I speak differently to my 6 and 8-year-old than I might to my students when I teach, or than I might to my thesis supervisor, or than I might to my friends when we're out dancing wildly on a Friday night, which I don't actually do, but I'd like to imagine that I do. So all of those are different audiences for different aspects of me, and sometimes online they collapse. And I've been very lucky navigating sort of those collapsed audiences as someone who has chosen to be a fairly full self online, right? I have narrated my parenthood, my studenthood, my professional life, all of those things with largely a sort of mirror ball, but with largely a collapsed audience. But I still am choosing to be seen, and the aspects, I know who those audiences are for the most part. And when somebody gets picked up, or when you, even when something that you've written goes to a different, I'm just thinking about the best way to frame this. So if you get picked up by the media, particularly the outrage media, or if you write for the New York Times or a different audience that brings you outside of the network who knows you, right? So if one of my research participants talked about this in my study, she said, when I started writing for the Chronicle of Higher Ed and the New York Times, this was Tressie McPhD, who's a great writer. She said, I can always tell when I've skipped audience, because suddenly the comments change completely and people stop treating her like a person that they know who is speaking, and rather like essentially a position to be argued with and sometimes to be put down. And the power relations that surround what kind of voices get recognized in social media reflect the really crappy and unequal power relations of our society. So they're racist and they're sexist and all of those things. And I have always tried to practice what I preach. I have encouraged my education students to be on Twitter, to be connected educators. And yet I am also encouraging them into a space where increasingly I see women slammed and shamed. I see, really significant racist put-downs of people's positions. And I'm not sure that I think there are real ethical issues around inviting people into a space that increasingly has some of the tone of anonymous newspaper comments. So that's my struggle with the issue of of vulnerability, because I think that both of those things are true, and I think both of them are an aspect of the human condition, perhaps. But increasingly, I think we're having to reckon with this public nastiness that seems to be a part of networked participation, and particularly for those of us who are thinking about encouraging students to use it as educators, or in terms of my own research and presenting it, speaking to non-networked educators and say, hey, come on in, I have gotten all this care and this, wonderful set of resources and ties from this experience, but, don't mind the trolls. I have some ethical challenges around that.
It's interesting thinking about some of these issues in the sense of social networks being reflections of our society in general, right? But at the same time shaping our practice. So this co-evolutionary change or shape in some ways, right? That networks bring with them and our practices bring to networks, often lead me to ask questions like, okay, we are in a situation where individuals are vulnerable when they are online because of a number of reasons. Individuals have the agency to choose to be vulnerable for a number of reasons. How do we address some of the issues that we see there, and in what ways? So are we talking about refining our platforms and our tools? Are we talking about teaching people how to play better with others? Are we where do we as educators need to be involved, and where do we as researchers not only need to focus on in terms of the type of research that we're doing, but who can we talk to make significant change in this area in such a way that the issues that you're talking about, abuse, sexism, racism, can be addressed? I know that's a huge question, and it probably was not on the question that I sent you, but I think you should feel free to try different directions here, and let's see where we go. And you can send the ball back to me if you want to, but I'll let you try that one out.
Okay. Well, I think yes, sure. And I mean, I hate to speak for we, because I can't really speak for we. I would love to see the various, sometimes intersecting communities that I'm involved in take more ownership of reflectively proceeding around the things that we do. And there are certainly a lot of voices in my networks who do reflect on these things and different aspects of these things often. I think two keys for me are, one, it's really important that we don't lose sight, again, speaking for me, of the fact that networks are relational. I'm very, very wary of techno-solutionist discourse. I'm very, very wary of the push in education to just adopt tools as if they are neutral. And I think that we need to be talking and thinking loudly about what it means to work with these things, and perhaps foregrounding some of the relational aspects of the communications here. And that can be challenging, particularly when you're thinking about scholarship, because frankly, my experience, at least, is that the scholarly community still does not have particularly effective ways of thinking about its own relational challenges and nature. There are ways in which even conventional scholarship is focused on, who you know, and hierarchies of scale. There are parallels in some ways between the game of succeeding at conventional scholarly impact and what some might think of as the game of succeeding at network scholarly impact. but in both cases, you end up quantifying things that are quite relational. And to me, when you do find care, particularly in networks, and if George, if you're able to put up the link to the SlideShare that I had posted on the blog post, there at the end of that SlideShare, the last 10 slides or so are focus on different aspects of care that my research participants talked about and performed and enacted in the period where I study them ethnographically. But they give credit to other people, and they check in with other people, and they talk about the value that they get from other people's work. And all of those things are ways of relationally building ties and expressing care in this larger community, might be a term for it, certainly network. But when we focus simply on quantifying what we do, whether online or offline, then we lose sight of all of the human pieces that actually underlie, in my case at least, a great deal of the thinking that I do. So I think with the people in my network, and I've had the privilege this year of thinking with the people in my research. A couple of those people have really mentored me in terms of guiding me, because some of them are far more senior as academics than I am, and others are peers sort of working through this same doctoral phase, and I've learned from both, but those have been relational connections. So that piece matters. The relational piece matters. The other thing that I think really matters is more back to that techno-solutionism piece. Audrey Waters talks a lot about being wary of the messages coming out of Silicon Valley and venture capital for ed tech in particular. And she just published a post 2 days ago based on the Dylan song, I don't want to work on Maggie. I ain't going to work on Maggie's farm no more. And I think it raises really important questions for really everybody in higher ed right now about what farms are we working on and what farms are we encouraging our students to work on, whether online or not, but particularly when we are bringing people into online spaces and encouraging people to move into networks. What power relations are we exposing them to? And I don't just mean the power relations of trolls and racism and sexism that I mentioned earlier, but also the power relations of surveillance and corporate capitalism. And what are we actually enacting in terms of creating spaces of pedagogy when we adopt tools that encourage algorithmic views of education and algorithmic views of human relations? So I don't have answers to your big question, but those are two of the things that I'm using as threads to think about some of that, for sure. What do you think, George?
That's a great question, Bonnie. It's been when I started studying this topic.
Mm-hmm.
I came into it looking at understanding what is it that people do, right? So what is it that people do on Twitter? What is it that they do on other spaces? Do the spaces where they do various things influence the things that they do?
Yeah.
Why do they choose particular spaces over others, right? And over time, I've seen kind of a shift in lots of ways, not only in terms of how people interact and participate in spaces, but also in terms of how we talk about these spaces, right? So, and when I say we, I mean in terms of researchers who are studying and thinking critically about the spaces. And it might be that the communities that I'm talking with more and more are kind of critical voices, or it might be that there's an increasing realization of how some of the technologies and the innovations that are pursued are shaping our participation. So, for example, there's a lot of conversation about how algorithms might change or might shape the ways that we participate, right? And that conversation is not necessarily new. For example, the ideas behind how Google Scholar might shape the resources that we find to cite in our research, are ideas that have been talked about for the past couple of years. But it seems like there's increasingly loud voices about ideas behind algorithms. So, for example, who is creating these things? Is it are algorithms supposed to be neutral? Should they be? Where do we draw the line? If we're talking about a corporation that is its main purpose is to create a profit, but we're willingly engaging with that, do we have any power in saying, okay, you need to be more open about your corporate practices, right? So in my world, I suppose, there's a big question around the technology, right? And at the same time, there's a big question of how do we best prepare our students to engage with some of these issues, right? In some of our research, we saw that once individuals start becoming uncomfortable with a space, like Facebook, for example, they will flee to something else. Without necessarily recognizing that some of the problems that they had with Facebook are also going to be present in that new space. So the struggle has been to help people realize or be more critical about the spaces and about the practices that these spaces encourage.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any comments on these ideas? I know that you've been thinking about algorithms as well.
I was actually just thinking as you were speaking. I think I wrote a post on this about a year and a half ago, but I no longer remember exactly what it was. But it was that sort of sense that when I first entered into the world of network scholarship, particularly in sort of the para-academic on the side stuff, I got this sense that there was, the institutional tradition, which in some ways I think we can all recognize, particularly around publishing, has become quite hidebound and doesn't make a lot of sense in the context of knowledge abundance and is mostly around preserving certain profit structures and traditions and things that, frankly, I wasn't deeply invested in. And so I saw networked practice as the kinder, gentler alternative, perhaps, to institutional scholarship. It was the place where the emancipatory history of open and all of the idealization, I guess, of open lived. And I do think that there is value in having that concept of an alternative space. But I also think that as networks have become more subscribed to and have shifted, it's really important that we be willing to let go of that idea that networks are removed from some of the power relations and even institutional hierarchies that shape academia, because increasingly there are corporate institutional hierarchies that underlie the logics of the platforms we interact on. And so while I still find value in the idea of openness and in the idea of the domain of one's own, that is not where most people are, and I need to be willing to apply the same critique, I guess, to networked practices as I was initially to the idea of scholarly and traditional scholarly practices. And that was kind of what I was thinking of as you spoke, right, is that emergence of maybe my own just coming to maturity in my thinking about knowledge practices and recognizing that there's never going to be an ideal or pure space for knowledge practices. It's always going to be a reflection of the societies that we live in, and our societies currently have some issues and driving forces that there are ways. I work a lot with Donna Haraway's concept of the cyborg, right? And I love the idea of the hybrid of human and machine that is kind of always blasphemous and always subversive to the conditions that create it. And I still think that there is something that operates in networks that is potentially subversive to the power structures that make both networks and institutions sometimes dehumanizing or not great places to be. But I think we need to keep making sure that the things that we're doing move in that direction.
You know, I really like this discussion partly because it centers around the idea of pausing and thinking critically about particular practices, right? And I'm increasingly seeing this in our field where we're quick to dismiss things like technosolutionism, right? We're quick to say, you know, technology is not going to solve everything. You need to think about X, pedagogy, or whatever it might be, right? But at the same time, we're quick to embrace practices that we believe are valuable, that might really impact people adversely. So, for example, the idea of open, right? There's lots of hope surrounding that idea, and it comes from a place of from a positive place, from a place of sharing, from a place of caring. But there are individuals who are in positions that are not privileged, who are in positions where their contextual factors prevent them from engaging in, you know, open practices, right? And encouraging them to do that might put them in situations that might be problematic. So I think the nuanced understanding of essentially things that we promote is really significant to us.
And I think too, even beyond sort of the structural identity, sort of racism and sexism and orientation and all those pieces, there's also the question of ableism and networked practices and what they rely on. So I'm a person who loves to write. I'm actually, you know, I think of myself as being more articulate in writing rather than just going blah 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 like this. I'm comfortable being public. I am reasonably extroverted. I learned a great deal from someone who was initially part of my research study and then left, but who taught me a great deal about the ways in which a structure like Twitter, which makes all of your contacts visible, you know, really privileges someone who is neurotypical, has a particular understanding of social nuance and types of humor and conversation, and has a comfort level engaging in that space in a visible way and having those things traceable to them. And I'm not sure that it is good or best that, you know, everybody be willing to live in the open. I'm not sure that everybody is geared to live in the open. I think that sometimes the kinds of discourse that dominate our spaces, the spaces that you and I at least share, George, right? Like we have enough of an overlapping network that we're probably familiar with a fair number of the same types of practices and norms of discussion. But those norms of discussion, well, I think of them as, hey, join in, may be very exclusive to some people. And, you know, all of those, there is not going to be any one medium or form of engagement that, or platform that works for everybody, but constantly being cognizant and forcing ourselves to look at in what ways do some people not receive welcome or receive care here is really, you know, key.
Yeah. Thanks for your comment, Bonnie. I'm gonna try and take some questions here from the people who've been sending them to us, and I'm not sure if you can see the Q&A board on the side. Can you, or should I read that question to you?
In another window, just one second.
Okay. Here, I can share the question.
Great, because for whatever reason it's not showing up for me.
Okay, yeah, no problem. So, so I have a question from Helen, and she basically says that work that she did with other individuals studying motivation of early adopters of open practices suggests that willingness to behave altruistically. I'm gonna say that word, altruistically. There you go, and accept risk. So their willingness to behave in that way and to accept risk depended largely on an established ethos of subject community. I imagine that means being part of a community in which an area was discussed. Do you have any, I guess, comments in regards to these findings in terms of how the idea of accepting risk and the idea of being willing to altruistically engage might impact online engagement?
I just want to clarify, Helen, do you mean like subject community as in discipline, or because I'm not sure that I'm not seeing, I'm only hearing what's being said, so I just want to, before I open my big mouth.
Yeah. So this question is on our Q&A, and I'm not sure if Helen is even here to add clarification. But I would suggest sharing any thoughts that you have on it that you're comfortable with sharing.
Sure. Without speaking directly to Helen's piece, simply because I'm not entirely sure that I understand, I have definitely seen altruism, or what I think probably counts as altruism in my networks. I'm always a little bit, and this may be the cynic in me, but a little bit wary of the idea of altruism. Initially, right back at the beginning of my... Oh, yeah.
And just jump in. Okay, Helen added, yes, so thumbs up, she's still here. But I guess that's what she means in your question with regard to subject community.
Like discipline?
Yes.
Okay. In terms of altruism, sometimes I tend to think that while I do see things that are definitely very much genuinely relational and acts of caring, at the same time, I think there is often some value that a person receives out of that, and so I'm never sure if that should appropriately be called altruism. I think it depends on how one sees what counts as sort of a selfless act. But the discipline piece probably matters. I think that, to me, this relates back to that idea of having a shared group of people, whether within a discipline or not, who understand what you're saying, right? And over time, when people construct a networked identity, they tend to build their networks relatively slowly and organically, or at least that has been the way to this point in most scholarly practice. People start often within discipline, and they may share their work, and people may have a sense of who they are, and they build this sense where people know what each other are talking about. And discipline-specific terms and discipline-specific premises certainly help with that. I don't think it's actually specific to networked scholars, because I used to see it in blogging as well, where you would have a group of people who all kind of were engaged in broadly the same sort of activity, and those people understood a we around what they were doing. And they might not all be doing the exact same thing, but there was something that they could kind of point to that was insider-outsider behavior. This was something that we do, and this was something that was not. And sometimes those groups would go back or would sort of cross swords. God, that doesn't seem appropriate. No. Anyway, sometimes they would bang up against each other because there were different belief systems. And I see that as very similar to what happens in disciplines. We tend to feel safe, I think, as human beings, when we understand that our intentions will be taken as good, right? And so within discipline, that would seem to make sense. I had the interesting experience with my research of looking at people who probably at least a good third of the people within my research actually have most of their network outside of their discipline. So it'd be really interesting, Helen, to see how those two types of findings mapped up.
Awesome. Thank you, Bonnie, and especially thank you for being willing to engage with me as I throw these curveballs at you. It's basically preparation for the doctorate, right?
No practice defense. There we go.
There you go. Yeah.
Very good.
It's one of those things. Just you gotta jump over it, and then you're done. So I have a couple of questions prepared that I think our audience would be really excited to hear your perspectives on. But I'd really love to know more about your research and your work in this area. And I think I do, but I'd like other people to as well, because I think it's significant. So could you share with us, some of your findings, perhaps the most significant ones, or the ones that you're really excited about? And I'll put that in quotes because of the topic. So I'll turn it over to you.
I would love to talk about my research. You may have to cut me off at a certain point here. A year ago, Tuesday, on the 4th of November, I released my call for participants for my dissertation study on Twitter. I had a wonderful group of responses from sort of across the English-speaking global academic sphere. That was basically, I was looking for a geographically broad and identity diverse group of people who came from different positions within the sort of academic prestige pecking order. So some senior scholars, junior scholars, early career researchers, graduate students. I ended up with 13 people who I spent 3 months observing on Twitter primarily, although also on the other platforms that they used regularly as part of their scholarship. I interviewed 10, and I had 12 who completed sort of documents for me, and I also did document analysis of their blogs, because everybody had blogs. Another group of the volunteers who I wasn't able to use, sometimes because I had like a bunch of people who all had some of the same identity markings, and I didn't just want to study female PhD students, or I didn't just want to study queer scholars in Australia or whatever. But I had a surprising number of sort of matched up people. So what I asked another group of folks to do was to be exemplar identities, because one aspect of the research was I had all of the participants look at Twitter screenshots of scholarly profiles and ask them to interpret how they read up the influence of those people and what they would kind of make of those profiles. Not in order to then say these are good profiles and these are bad profiles, but rather to try to dig into what are the implicit literacies and norms that are circulating around who we take seriously in these spaces, and in what ways does this end up replicating some of the academic pecking order, and in what ways does it maybe create its own new pecking order, and are there pieces that maybe do get heard more or privileged in networks that are not necessarily part of what we have conventionally called scholarship. So I'm looking at concepts of academic influence as well as network practice. What I was really excited about, I think the first, I'm doing a 3-paper type of thesis. So the first paper that I did was on the profiles and influence, and I was fascinated to find out that almost everybody who went through that process of looking at other people's profiles did not stop at the picture. And I had kind of hoped and assumed from my own practices that might be the case, but I was excited to find out that no, most people are not simply looking at the surface metrics, and the majority reported actually clicking, going over to Twitter and looking through the person's stream before making sort of a knee-jerk judgment about them, while at the same time, they are always reading the signals that are there and are making judgments based on those signals. The other key piece that I found really interesting from that part of the research was when people were talking about who they follow and why they follow them. It was deeply tied to their own personal concepts of why they are engaged in network practice in the first place. And the overarching theme, for the most part, was to make a contribution. And often to make a contribution in a way that institutional practice doesn't necessarily allow. So particularly for the people who were early career scholars, adjuncts, grad students, to make a contribution that simply is not available in the prestige hierarchy to them at this point, even though they have things that they know and can share. Sometimes the opportunities to do so are not available within their institutional context. Sometimes, especially particularly for those who are female, otherwise marginalized as identities or voices in some way, often we're getting heard, getting more traction in terms of being heard in their networks than they were in their institutional participation. So I found that really interesting. The other piece that I'm loving unpacking right now is this idea of care and vulnerability as part of scholarship. And so the paper that I'm writing right now looks at your very useful concept of NPS and looking at Boyer. Is it Boyer or Boyer?
I don't know. You're asking the wrong person.
Who had four key points of scholarship. I'm looking at people's practices in light of Boyer's forms of scholarship, and then at the care and the vulnerability that end up being represented there. And it's been interesting because my participants, there was a definite spectrum of sort of the professional to the personal, and some people use networks much more instrumentally, and others use it much more intimately. And it was clear really from the time that I began engaging with and following folks, the patterns tended not to change a great deal. But I had an experience actually just today, this morning, that was kind of fascinating about the ways in which the longevity of networks ends up bringing a personal piece even into the more professional relationships that exist there. So I had a fellow who is a fairly senior scholar in his field, which is social work, who I had actually never heard of before he volunteered to be part of the research. He's based in the States, and he tweets under the handle at, I think it's at Social Work Podcast. Social Work Podcast is his brand, and he actually does not tweet under his own name, although the name is there, but the actual Twitter handle is the brand of his podcast, which he has been putting out for about 7 years as a very professional sort of roundup and discussion of issues in the field of social work, which is not my field, so not a ton of intersections there. And I interviewed him, and he talked very much about how he thinks about his network relatively instrumentally. He only follows people that he thinks would be relevant to his followers, type of thing. So he actually, I don't think, followed me back during the research because I don't relate to the social work world. And he there's not a lot of chit chat on his Twitter feed or his Facebook feed or any of his other spaces about sort of him, the person. However, in the process, great guy to talk to, learned a great deal. I'm still following him, and we ended up, because I was also following him on Facebook, being Facebook friends. This morning, he posted, it's the 6th of November, and he posted a post that said, "My dear sweet teapot." And it was, as soon as I read it, I explained how I began online. It was a note to his dead child on the occasion of his birthday. I had no idea that the child existed. He had no idea about how I began online or that I had shared that experience. I ended up just sending him a little note, but it was good to make that contact and strange to have those worlds circle around, because we are all in the end even though we're scholars and even though we're doing, real work and all those things, we are also people with lives. And one of the things that networks allow is some bleed that can be valuable between those lives and those ideas. And it was really sort of powerful to me to have that strange little happenstance this morning. And I said, I'm talking to the Scholar 14 group today. Can I tell them about Teapot? And he said, I would be honored, to have him mentioned. But that's the thing that networks have ended up bringing me, is random, unexpected connections and, papers to cite and all kinds of things that are valuable in different ways. But that's where the care piece comes in, right? If you spend enough time with people, you have the opportunity to develop these relational networks of caring with them.
Absolutely. And on our end, I want to thank you for sharing that story with us, because I think it's significant to hear those stories and to share those stories and to let these stories grow and expand beyond our own individual networks, which is going to lead me to the next question from one of our audience members. But increasingly finding that writing these stories and sharing these stories is important. And in addition to that, understanding why people do the things that they do. So for me in particular, in this area, I'm really interested in understanding the moment that people decide that they will go online and share a story that is so close to their heart, that is, difficult to share, right? And understand the reasons for doing so, their thought process while doing so, whether they've encountered what they were desiring to encounter when they were, sharing that story. So, and partly because we met in networks, I'm excited to, follow your work and hear from your work and let my work inform yours, So it's all a big circle, I find, which is fascinating. So the question that I wanted to pass along, and we're coming to the end here, is from Jenny Magnus, all the way from the UK.
Hi, Jenny.
And she's asking if you have any thoughts about homophily as a potential problem. So the idea of echo chambers, right? So this is the idea that when we're online, we might find ourselves in communities that essentially reinforce our beliefs, and in communities where we're sharing we're sharing some beliefs and we're getting positive feedback on that. So do you have any thoughts about that being a potential problem? And if I may add a follow-up on how to address that, if it is an issue.
I think it definitely is a problem. I think the way that I approach it, I was interested in this when I did my research, and it was one of the questions that I asked some of my interview participants particularly, is sort of when you are choosing to follow people or to engage with people, do you think about both differences in identity markers, and do you think about differences in positions, and how do you engage across positions? Most of the folks I was talking to, I had all been on Twitter for at least 2 years, all had blogs, we're all fairly heavily networked, and so for the most part actually referenced homophily or the idea of echo chambers and not filtering, and a number said that they actively do try to sort of follow diversely, whatever that means to them, because they are a little bit wary of having a full-on echo chamber. I think at the same time, most of the ways that people specified that was more around visible identity markers rather than around maybe differences of discipline, opinion, politics, because those are the places where social media can be particularly fraught, right? And so it's interesting to me, and I think that it is important that any of us who are engaging in the practice of being network scholars, whatever that means to us, think about echo chambers and try to look broadly for different facets of perspective. At the same time, I would say that we now have a language for that, and I don't think it's actually unique to selected networks. I find that academia and disciplines often act like echo chambers as well, but we don't have a particularly strong built-in reflexivity around that. And so, to some extent, at least in my own case and in my own practice, I have found that my sort of face-to-face institutional world and discipline ends up contrasting to an extent with my network world and the couple of disciplines that I intersect with there. And so I end up having to navigate and negotiate conflicting worldviews and unsustainable concepts that don't fit together fairly regularly because of those. I'm a human being, and I can probably only handle so many of those in a given day. And so the fact that I kind of already have that built-in piece that doesn't always fit ends up being pretty ripe for thought for me, and each allows me to be reflexive about the other. But I do think that what I don't have, like in my own networks, are a ton of people from, for instance, outside the English-speaking sphere. And I need to at least be aware when I think of my networks that there's this massive swath of the world missing from what I may tend to think of as a fairly diverse or global group, because really it's not. And I think that's where the danger is. Not necessarily in having, a bunch of opinions that may only be this big, that you're pushing back and forth against each other to think with, but losing sight of the fact that those opinions are only this big, right? And that you don't have actually the huge diversity of input that you might think you do. You got to constantly be thinking about who's missing.
Bonnie, thank you so much. We're coming towards the end of our session here, and I want to give you an opportunity to leave us with some departing thoughts before I close the session. So I'm just going to turn it over, and when I did this to Royce last week, he said, "No, I think we've covered everything. We're good to go."
We're good.
So you can do the same, or you can share with us your last final thoughts before I close it.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you very much to everybody for tuning in. I've seen little bits of Twitter chat sort of popping up on my screen through this, and that'll give me stuff to think with as well. The last piece for me that I think I haven't mentioned in the blog post that I put up in advance of this, but I wanted to talk about in terms of networks of care and vulnerability, again relates to the intersection between networks and academia, and it's the question of legibility. And I think that sometimes when you're doing something that isn't necessarily legible within your field, there is great value in having that robust network who do understand and in some cases embody and enact the things that you are trying to talk about. And so for me, I have a great deal of gratitude, not only for the personal care that I've received in my networks, for the incredible professional development, really, and mentorship that I've received in my networks, but also really just for the fact that over these past few years, as my work has developed and my thinking has developed, that people have been willing to come to my blog and sometimes push back against the things I'm saying, or in fact, in a few cases go, nope, that metaphor is just totally wrong and here's why, and that's great, but they understood enough to push back, and that legibility has meant a great deal to me. And I think it's not that isn't always where there is not a clearly laid path to follow. Having a network can be really valuable for all of the fraught challenges that come with it, the vulnerabilities that come with it, and hopefully the care that comes with it as well, if you choose to give it back.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Awesome. thank you so much for taking the time and for participating and sharing your thoughts. And
it was my pleasure. This whole course has been really great.
oh, thank you. On behalf of participants as well, I want to thank you. I know that they've been very appreciative of you and your time. And I'm looking forward to great things from you, Bonnie. And we'll talk soon.
Okay. Have a great day, everybody. Thanks for being here.
Take care, Bonnie.
Bye. Take care. See you.